Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. We're going to have an amazing show. We're going to be speaking with Nick Pope and Pat Fransconia. See, I almost said it right. About the encounter at Rendlesham Forest. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healings, and psychic readings. It's also brought to you by the Institute of the Applied Energetics, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. We have so much to cover today, so I'm just going to introduce our guests, and we are going to move forward. Author, journalist, and TV personality Nick Pope used to run the British government UFO project at the Ministry of Defense. Initially skeptical, his research and investigation into the UFO phenomena and access to classified government files on the subject soon convinced him that the phenomena raised important defense and national security issues. He is now recognized as one of the world's leading experts on UFOs, the unexplained, and conspiracy theories. Pat Fransconia earned a BS degree in geology from the University of California at Los Angeles, and thereafter studied abroad at the prestigious Goethe Institute in Munich, West Germany. As a legislative assistant to Congressman, Pat was responsible for constituent services and preparation of congressional hearing testimonies in issues related to Department of Energy, Forest Service, and the Department of Interior, including Bureaus of Indian Affairs, Land Management, and Reclamation. Okay, I'm just going to skip down. In 2011, Pat organized the Mississippi UFO Conference, in which John and Jim were invited to give their presentations on the Rendlesham Forest incident. Following the conference, Pat was asked to help them with their struggle to obtain information and medical records related to the encounter in Rendlesham Forest. So please welcome to the show, Nick Pope and Pat Fransconia. Hey guys, how are you?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, fine. Great to be on the show. Thank you.
So I think we're going to have a jam-packed episode tonight. But Nick, I'm going to start with you. I think everyone has heard of the alleged UFO crash at Roswell. And today we're going to be talking about the encounters that happened at Rendlesham Forest. In an overview, where and when did this encounter take place?
These events took place actually over a series of 3 nights in December 1980 in the UK, involving 2 American bases. This was part of the wider US presence in Europe. This was the height of the Cold War, of course. On the first night, strange lights were seen in the forest, and the initial thought was that a light aircraft had crashed and started a fire. The 2 witnesses who were center to this whole incident, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, went out there into the forest with a number of other people and encountered not a crashed aircraft, but a landed UFO. Now, we can get to the details later, but suffice to say the UFO returned and was seen on a second night. And on the third night, when it came back, witnesses on that occasion included the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, who to this date is probably the highest ranking military officer ever to have seen and reported a UFO whilst on duty. That's the whole thing condensed into a minute or two, but we'll doubtless get into a whole lot of other details about what happened. And of course, more importantly, in a sense, the effect that it had on John, Jim, and some of the other witnesses, which of course is where Pat comes in with his quest for justice for the individuals involved.
Yeah, and Pat, how do you fit into this whole scenario? You weren't a witness to it, so what's your role in bringing the story forward?
My role, back in 2008 was the first time that I ever became aware of the Rendlesham Forest incident. I'd always had an interest in this topic regarding UFOs, but I'd never had anything come up before that got my attention about that particular incident until 2008. I put it kind of in the back of my mind, but thought to myself I would like to meet the principals involved in that incident. Excuse me. So, in 2011, I had organized a UFO conference for Mississippi and invited John Burroughs and Jim Penniston because really I just wanted to meet them and hear from them firsthand. And it was in doing that while they were here before they left, they told me of the problems they were having in trying to get medical records, and particularly John Burroughs, who was suffering a number of health problems related to the incident, and asked for my help. And it was a very easy decision to make, and that's where it all began for me.
Cool. Excellent. And I'm just going to throw the questions out unless I call your name specifically, and you guys can figure out who is going to answer what ones. Where I want to start in kind of unraveling this whole thing is the idea that the bases that John Burroughs and Jim Pendleton were based at were actually U.S. bases in the U.K., which I don't really understand because I thought they were our friends. But the other part to that question is how big or active was this base?
Well, the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge were part of, the US military presence in the UK dates back to the Second World War, where, of course, so many American service personnel came over to the UK as part of the fight against the Axis powers. And, of course, D-Day was launched from the UK. And that American military presence in the UK after the Second World War effectively morphed into the Cold War. The Americans stayed at the invitation of the UK. And frankly, of course, had we not had that American military presence in the UK and indeed throughout much of Western Europe, there would have been little militarily to stop the Soviet Union just rolling westwards with their tanks and their troops. So that's the legacy of it all. But in December 1980, when the Rendlesham Forest incident took place, and by the way, it's called Rendlesham Forest because Rendlesham Forest lies between the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge, where this all happened. At the time, these twin bases were among the most strategically important in the entire NATO military alliance. They were home to the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing, which flew the A-10 tank busters, but they had a whole bunch of other roles too. And even to this day, the true extent of their mission probably can't be discussed without without getting into classified areas. So suffice to say that these really were two of the most important military bases in NATO. So the fact that the Rendlesham Forest incident plays itself out at this location makes it interesting and important before we even get to the details of what happened.
Any commentary on there, Pat?
Well, I think Nick tells that the best of anyone. Everything he said certainly tells just how important these installations were. And, of course, the rumored atomic ordnance that was at Bentwaters only, I believe, Nick, made it all the more important, certainly.
Absolutely. I'm not able to discuss any of those nuclear questions, of course, because of my security oath. But there's a lot of material out there on the web for those people that want to look at it. And actually, Pat, I'm probably going to slightly stray into your area here. We may not get into any of this, but I think it's just important to set the scene. But of course, there are quite a lot of legal treaties and memoranda of understandings that really regulate and kind of define the whole constitutional basis of the U.S. military presence in U.S. military presence in the UK. I mean, the overarching agreement is the NATO Status of Forces Act, but there are a number of other things. It's actually quite an interesting question in terms of jurisdiction and primacy. And you often, when discussing the Rendlesham Forest incident, we get into this debate about, well, hey, wait a minute, is it the Americans or the Brits that were in charge of all this? And it sounds like a simple question, but it's actually not, because jurisdiction can be concurrent. In other words, two or more organizations or nations can have jurisdiction over something. The real question is who has primacy. In other words, who leads on this. But questions like that are a little bit technical, and maybe we won't even get to that.
But and let me just ask, because I understand that if there's a military base or an embassy, that is considered sovereign American soil, but this didn't happen on the base. This happened outside the base. So I could see where it would become a little bit up in the air who would be responsible or in charge.
That's absolutely right. The incident itself happened in Rendlesham Forest, which lies between the two bases. So therefore, you're quite correct. It's outside the wire. It's absolutely on UK national soil. On the other hand, it would be odd and indeed untenable if you had a situation where the US military could not respond immediately to a perceived security situation that took place outside the wire. I mean, you know, imagine the nightmare scenario, I suppose, of a Spetsnaz attack or a terrorist attack on the bases. Clearly, you're not going to have time to sort of place phone calls to the local police and say, oh, can we have your permission? No, so the US military have to have that immediate authority to respond to a security situation, real or imagined, outside.
If I may add to that, excuse me, Nick, Jim Penniston initially thought that he was dealing with an airplane crash, did he not?
Yes.
And so it was an emergency situation as it was perceived by the men on the ground at that time.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And in those situations where human life is adjudged to be at risk, you don't stop and make phone calls about jurisdiction. You just get out there.
Well, how did this whole thing start? So you brought up Jim's name in relationship to this incident. So was he one of the first people going out of the gate to investigate this thought crashed plane? How did it all begin?
Nick, you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. Well, yes, absolutely. John Burroughs and Jim Penniston were two of the first responders. Most of the witnesses were security police and law enforcement personnel. They're the ones who tend to be, this was late at night, and they're the ones who tend to be on duty, up and about, responding to any unusual situation that develops. And yes, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston drove out from the gate in a Jeep with some other personnel, but John and Jim were the main witnesses. Then the path they were following into the forest got too narrow. They had to leave the Jeep. They proceeded on foot. And their radios were cutting out all the time. It was very strange. There was interference in the forest. One of the people who had seen this thing was asked, come on, what's happened? What is it with this crash? And he said it didn't crash, it landed. So when John Burroughs and Jim Penniston went out there, they knew that something strange had happened, but nothing could prepare them for what was to happen next. They got to a small clearing, and they found, as I said in my introductory remarks, not a crashed aircraft, but a landed UFO, an object around about 9 feet across, 6 feet high, broadly triangular in shape. But what was particularly interesting and disconcerting about this was it had strange hieroglyphic symbols on the side of it, a little bit like Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now, of the two men who approached, it was Jim Penniston who was the real expert in aircraft recognition, whether it was NATO aircraft or indeed Soviet Warsaw Pact aircraft. And he said this was like no aircraft or drone that he's seen at the time, or indeed in the 35 years or so since this took place. He said this was like nothing he'd ever seen before. And there was simply, they had no frame of reference for dealing with any of this.
What were the... Actually, I'll say it this way. I have known a number of individuals who have served in the Air Force, and you'll be out somewhere and a plane goes by and they're like, up F-16 or up this or up that, because they just have been exposed to different aircraft. They have interest in aircraft. And, you mentioned that Jim was an expert in different military aircraft. What were John and Jim's roles as far as their positions and their ranks in the Air Force? Because this was an Air Force base, correct?
Yes, the United States Air Force bases. So, both were in the United States Air Force. John Burroughs at the time was a fairly new recruit, airman first class. I mean, he's since gone on to do 27 years of active and reserve duty in the USAF. And Jim Penniston, who was a sergeant at the time and the senior on-duty police specialist, he went on to serve more than 20 years. So as you can tell, with 27 years and 20 years respective active and reserve duty, these are two extremely well-qualified individuals. And as I say, Jim Penniston in particular at the time, being the sergeant who was effectively the senior security specialist on duty at the time, he was the person to whom the senior command personnel at the twin bases would turn to for advice on any unusual security situation. So there was a lot of responsibility resting on his shoulders. I mean, he and indeed John, this was a fairly high-pressure environment. These are not people who can really afford the luxury of getting things wrong.
Well, isn't that also part of security training? I would think that it would be like police training where you are taught to, critically observe and then report and not make stuff up because you kind of think it's some way or another.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, again, without wanting to go and get too overly technical, there's a difference between law enforcement, which is what most I suppose people would understand by policing, and the wider security duties of the base. But I mean, as with all installations of this, the critical point is that nothing must occur that impacts negatively upon the operational effectiveness of these bases. I mean, I mentioned right at the outset the fact that these were two of the most strategically important bases in NATO. Everything is about what in the military is called, the operational imperative. You must be unfettered when it comes to the ability to carry out your mission. I mean, if you're not able to carry out the mission, if something happens and the base can't undertake its primary operational purpose, then it's a disaster scenario.
And I would assume that people that were brought into this base were given a certain amount of training or were brought onto this base because they had certain levels of qualifications that made them be beneficial for the operation and functioning of this location.
Yes, no one's thrown into this sort of environment cold, and even the people who are new recruits, of course, they have their pre-deployment training. I mean, the whole ethos of the military, whether it's the U.S. military or the UK military, is this phrase, and you may have come across this: train hard, fight easy. Well, as I say these days, with operations such as Afghanistan and Iraq, I don't think anyone would say that there's any easy fighting to be done. But again, suffice to say that realistic and hard training is absolutely integral to the US military. And long before their boots hit the ground at these bases, people will have been trained to deal with most things, obviously. And again, height of the Cold War, what you're trained for is, for example, that transition to war and war situation. Are you dealing with Russian special forces? Are you dealing with sabotage, subversion? However, even with the best will in the world, there are some things, and we get into this with UFOs and the paranormal, there are some things that you just can't train for because they're so absolutely outside of your normal sphere of expertise and experience that how can you?
Any thoughts on what John and Jim thought when they saw this craft? I mean, obviously it was outside their normal range of encounter, but any insights into what their reaction to it was?
Pat, do you want to take that one? I
was just thinking in that regard. Again, Jim Penniston initially thought that they were dealing with a downed aircraft. As they approached the craft, several things started to happen. One was they noticed a static electricity field to the air. Jim has told me that he felt like things were kind of in slow motion. It's hard to describe, but it was like time had slowed somehow. The object or the craft itself, which initially was a brilliant white light, and then it would later turn the same before it left, Jim described as having a number of different colors flowing through the skin of the craft, as if not like an incandescent or fluorescent light, but it was the actual material itself. They didn't know what they were dealing with. John Burroughs had the least recall of what had happened, but also suffered the most physical injury, which is something I can speak about in a little while about him in that regard. Jim, of course, did the walk around. They knew they were dealing with something unusual, and as Nick had referenced before, with Jim being able to identify various aircraft, this was one he couldn't identify. Although he was trying to do so with his police notebook and writing down what he was seeing and sketching out the outline of the craft. But it became pretty apparent as they got within close proximity of it that this was something that they had not been trained to deal with before, nor did they know what it was.
Well, I'll bet. Okay, and it was just those two that actually saw the craft and interacted with the craft. What were the other guys doing at that point in time that went out?
Well, that was the first night. There was Ed Kabansik, who had stayed back somewhat. He was part of the three, John Burroughs, Jim Penniston, because they had a radio relay set up. They were having problems with that, the radio transmissions, and then, of course, the others from the base that were out there, but they were much farther back. Jim and John were the only two that first night that got anywhere close enough to actually look at it and observe it from an up-close perspective.
Okay. But those guys, even though they were away, did they have an experience of their own other than the electrical shortages or, equipment malfunction type things?
Observation from a distance, meaning lights. But,
okay, so they're okay. I'll shut up.
But certainly not touching it like Jim did.
Mm-hmm.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, Pat's just made an important point. I mean, for a lot of people who talk about UFOs, they have this image in their mind of some distant lights in the sky. I think it's important, again, to just focus back on the point that this was not lights in the sky. This was a landed, structured, apparently metallic craft of some sort that was so close that Jim Penniston was able to do this walk around to sketch the craft. And there's certainly a sketch of it on my website, which is nickpope.net. He sketched the craft, he sketched the symbols on the side of the craft, and he touched the symbols on the side of the craft. And of course, it's this close proximity to the craft that, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, both John Burroughs and Jim Penniston believe that medical problems that they have had in later years were attributable to their minds to this close encounter. And of course, and again, this is where Pat comes in as the crusading attorney who's done so much to champion this. This is where ultimately there was a big fight between the witnesses and the Veterans Administration, and indeed, ultimately, perhaps a spectacular victory that kind of got rather less mainstream media coverage than one would have expected, given the sensational nature of how this resolved itself.
Well, and that's the part that I find interesting. I mean, I have spoken to you about this in the past and some other UFO experts in the past. But when the incident actually happened, it really didn't get much press or much airtime. And with so much, in my opinion, observational evidence and tangible evidence as far as the notes and stuff like that, and having 3 days of encounters, it just flabbergasted me that it kind of went away or really wasn't discussed. Was that because of the military aspect to it?
Yeah, that's a part of it. But I think another part of it is just societal. I think we forget, living as we do now, just what it was like before everyone had cell phones, before everyone had the internet, before there was any such thing as social media. This story was effectively suppressed for a long time, mainly because the witnesses just didn't really have a chance to get together as they now would on sites like Facebook. I mean, John and Jim after this happened, did not meet again in person, I believe, till about 2007. I mean, that's extraordinary. Nowadays, if something like this would happen, it would probably be all over Facebook and Twitter in an instant. You've only got to see how any breaking news story unfolds in this multimedia society to see how something goes down. But people forget what it was like before all that, and people forget that in 1980, if you were basically told by your senior officers, something's happened, we're not going to tell you exactly what, but if you talk about this, you're going to jail or whatever. People just shut up and they didn't say anything. And there was no opportunity for anyone to kind of get together and discuss things and maybe leak things in the way that would happen now. I mean, it was a totally different era. And this subject, the Rendlesham Forest incident didn't appear really in the media until 3 years later, in 1983. But like I say, in terms of the witnesses, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston actually sitting down around a table together over a cup of coffee and chewing the fat and saying, hey, what about this thing that happened to us? I mean, it was decades later. Decades.
Interesting. Anything, Pat?
No, well said by Nick. It's funny because John Burroughs was at one point stationed in Arizona. And I believe, Nick, it was about the time of the DeCaro story, CNN Chuck DeCaro, that you were referencing when you said 3 or so years after the incident. And John started to be questioned by some media about the story, and he was transferred to Korea. So just like Nick was talking about, get him out of the country. There were no cell phones, no Twitter, no email. So you do that, and you've effectively sent somebody to the North Pole. Nobody can get that.
Yes, and that's absolutely right. And it wasn't just John that this happened to. We've talked about John Burroughs and Jim Penniston being the closest to this, but if you widen the net, and we'll probably go on to talk about Colonel Charles Holt and his encounter in a little while, but if you were to draw up a list of the names of people that had seen, maybe not as close as John and Jim, and indeed Charles Holt on the third night, but if you draw a list up of the people who'd seen something unusual, it would be dozens and dozens. And we have, and we put into our book on this case, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, literally dozens of people. And we have reliable testimony from people who said that after this incident went down, exactly what Pat just said happened with John, happened right across the board. There was highly unusual military posting policy changes. And these people, these witnesses, these dozens of people were scattered to the four winds, posted to this base and that base all around the world. And when you think of what a wide footprint the U.S. military has, I mean, that's some went to Korea, some went to Germany, some went to other places in the UK, some went back to the continental United States. These people really were scattered, and it's difficult not to come to the conclusion that that was a deliberate tactic to keep these people apart and to stop them in this pre-internet, pre-cell phone, pre-social media environment, to stop them from networking with each other in the way that they would undoubtedly network today.
It just seems strange. Everyone talks about having a UFO land on the White House lawn, and this is almost, landing right outside an Air Force military base is kind of almost similar to that. Why cover it up when we have the opportunity to bring it forward?
Well,
come on, Pat, you're laughing, so it's up to you.
Yeah, Pat, you've laughed, so you can take that first.
I subscribe to the theory that it's actually very simple. initially, the whole reason this sort of thing, not just talking about Rendlesham, but preceding, was kept secret or away from the public's view is because it was just such an incredible, situation. I mean, how do you just suddenly tell everybody? And I think it quickly morphed into a matter of money. And so Nick has talked extensively about this in other programs and such, about weaponizing things, and it's about the military. When the military gets a hold of something, it's not about for the good of humanity, it's about how it can be used by the military. And given the fact that we were in the Cold War, particularly when this happened, there's no question that all of those factors were right front and center in determining what was going to happen to the story.
Okay, so we have the four guys that went out, and John and Jim got up close and personal with this triangular craft. Now they go back to the base. What happens? Did their co-workers, the other people on the base, think they were crazy? How was this whole encounter taken by those people in charge? Because I'm sure it went up the ladder.
Well, they certainly didn't think they were crazy. And indeed, because John and Jim had been out there and for the last part of the encounter, out of radio contact, they'd actually been on the point of throwing together a search team to go out and recover John and Jim because they didn't know what had happened to them. But yes, you're quite right. It went up the chain of command. It went to the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. It went to the base commander, Ted Conrad, and it went to the wing commander, the commanding officer of the twin bases, Gordon Williams. So very quickly, all the senior personnel at the base were aware of this. And of course, as I say, while John and Jim and a few others went out and actually had the close encounter, an awful lot of other people were watching back from the base and could see strange lights. Now, I didn't get into this, but shortly beforehand, an uncorrelated target was tracked on radar directly over the bases and then was seen to descend into the forest. So this did not happen in isolation. A lot of people at the bases knew something was going down. They knew that something very unusual was happening. People were checking what was being tracked on radar. People were in the control tower, the air traffic control tower, monitoring what was going on. Some of them were looking out with binoculars, some with the naked eye. It was clear that a major and highly unusual situation was unfolding. And as I say, there were dozens of witnesses who, if they didn't get as close as John and Jim, certainly could corroborate that something was happening.
So there are actually radar, I don't know what they call it, tapes or imagery, because aren't they supposed to save that stuff? The telemetry?
Yeah, they saved them for a shorter period of time. But again, we have reliable testimony from a number of the on-duty military personnel concerned to say that actually some of the radar tapes were immediately sequestered and then
lost.
Yeah, sent. So I was going to try and put this politely, considering that I'm still bound by my secrecy oath. I was going to say taken to a secure location, shall we say?
For safekeeping. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Because that was a big question that I had, was if they thought it was a plane that went down, then there should be something. I mean, it is an Air Force base, so I would think they had airplanes, which would mean they'd have a tower, which would mean they had radar. And so it sounds like the radar people and the flight control people saw that there was something going on kind of at the same time the whole thing was happening on the ground. Would that be a correct statement?
Yes. I mean, obviously, most aircraft, whether they're military aircraft or commercial ones, will carry a transponder. So whether it's a commercial transponder or a military aircraft carrying the IFF, identify friend or foe, there would be data available. But it's not inconceivable to suggest that someone would be operating. I mean, for example, if you look at unlisted drugs flights, I mean, there are some circumstances where you could envisage a light aircraft without a transponder and something like that. But still, the primary radar would detect an uncorrelated target. And again, I probably can't say too much about radar capabilities, but again, you can pretty much take it that if there's something flying over the UK or the continental United States, if someone's doing their job properly, they'll be able to track it one way or the other.
Pat, maybe you can answer this question because I think this is a good one for you. You mentioned that John didn't really have any memory or not as good memories of what happened. Pat, and I'm just going to kind of lay out the scenario, Pat felt like things were going in slow motion. With all of this happening, was there also, especially for John, a situation of kind of missing time?
That has been postulated. That is one possibility. John doesn't have, like I said, he doesn't have the depth of experience during that incident that, say, Jim Penniston had. And there's a question as to just what did happen to him. Jim was not really aware of what was happening to John because he was so hyper-focused on his walk around of the craft and recording what he was witnessing in his policeman's notebook. So we really don't know. But we also know, and I mentioned this earlier, that John is perhaps the most severely injured from the incident. So we don't know if perhaps that had something to do with the reason he didn't have as much recall of what happened.
Earlier, Nick, I guess you were talking about that they were having radio issues, radio failures, which I could see if there's a high electromagnetic field in an area that it could interfere with electronics working. Do you think, and this is to you, Pat, that that's part of what possibly happened to John?
Well, we know what happened to John. We know. John was affected by a certain frequency of electromagnetic radiation, if you will. That radiation damaged his heart. He had come into the military, into the Air Force in early 1979. This happened in late 1980. So he had been in about almost 2 years. When he went in as a very young man, late teens, he had no issues whatsoever physically, or at least none worth mentioning. Nothing major, that's for certain. However, immediately or virtually immediately after this incident, he had heart valve damage, along with some other, compared to that, minor problems that resulted from the incident. And it would be that heart damage that he would eventually get care from the Veterans Administration. In fact, I went to Tucson for his surgery back in December of 2013 to fix that specific problem that he had suffered back in 1980. The same damage to him that he would ultimately, in January of this year, finally win a disability award, full disability, from the Veterans Administration, making it the first time that the Veterans Administration has ever linked proximity to a UFO, health problems or damage to one's body being so close to, ever. So it makes it absolutely a groundbreaking case, a victory.
Well, I think it's groundbreaking that they took responsibility. I mean, I have friends that were in the first Gulf War that were And Agent Orange, I don't know, they came home with a lot of health issues, and the government's like, nah, it's not anything that you experienced in the Gulf War. So to have them give an award, and it was associated to an alleged UFO encounter.
Well, Dr. Rita?
Like
Sorry, I was going to say, I'm not sure it's a case of them taking responsibility. And Pat's probably too modest to say this, so maybe I can set this up. It wasn't so much the VA taking that responsibility. It was Pat, through hundreds, if not thousands, of his own pro bono hours on John and Jim's behalf, forcing them into a position where they had no option but to settle because of, in part, a UK government story, a UK government document that Pat was able to cite. But if Pat will forgive me for having kind of painted him into a corner on this, but Pat does deserve the credit for this. So I'm gonna suggest that Pat tells the story of how he won that particular victory. And it wasn't a VA concession; it was a Pat victory.
Well, we'll take the victory. Go for it, Pat.
Well, first of all, let me set the stage. When any veteran who's had to deal with the VA on disability matters knows that it's about as difficult as trying to get someone with the IRS on the phone to give you money back when you've overpaid. Okay? That's kind of how hard it is. Okay. So when we talk about the VA finally taking care of John, not just with the surgery, a life-saving surgery, in Tucson in 2013. You got to keep in mind, and I didn't come on board this until 2011. John had been working on all by himself for literally decades to try to get them to do something, to try to get them to recognize, not so much from the disability standpoint, but just the medical attention. He couldn't get his medical records. You'll recall earlier I referenced when I came on board. We started there. We also started with the mindset that we were going to become as noisy as we could become. So we started with FOIA requests, radio shows, interviews, you name it, press releases, constantly trying to make noise. Nick is correct. I think eventually it was all of that sort of thing that put them in a corner where they had to do something. They really had to. They not only had a man who had been legitimately injured while in the line of duty as an active soldier, he was not being taken care of, and he was, quite frankly, he was at death's door, and he was going to pass over to the other side if somebody didn't do something on this side of that door to save him that had the skills to do it. And the Condon report that Nick referenced, Nick is the one being modest here. Nick had a lot to do with that report. And there was a page from that report that would ultimately be referenced by the VA in this, that John, through his own efforts, was adding everything he could while we were trying to get this done. Not to mention, one more, a pair of United States senators, starting with Senator John Kyle of Arizona, who tried to help us for a year, who did disclose for us that John's medical records were classified. So you have an injured veteran, classified medical records, and civilian doctors saying, hey, we could certainly use those classified records to know what we're dealing with John Burroughs today. But nobody would give them up. Quite literally putting John's life out there to let him die for the sake of keeping this thing a secret. And that's the kind of calculus that really just, if it doesn't make you mad, it really, really, it makes you sad for how things can be.
It doesn't make any sense that he couldn't get his own medical. I mean, how do you classify somebody's medical records from yourself? That's crazy.
As I understand from those in the know, certain situations, Rendlesham absolutely qualifies as one of these. Certain incidents that occur that you may have people involved in, not just talking about John Burroughs, Jim Penniston, Colonel Holt, but others, and Nick will do well to speak to this point in a moment if he would, that come in after an incident. Scientists, intelligence people, that sort of thing. If they want to keep that a secret as to who was even there, then any of those kinds of records that might have a reference, and we don't know what they're referencing, but we know they must reference somebody. Maybe it's a certain doctor, a certain type of scientist that only shows up when certain things happen that we don't want anybody else to know happens. That's basically it.
Yes, that's.
Go ahead, Nick.
That's yeah. I'll pick that up. I mean, that's absolutely right. Now, if you'll forgive me for just reading something, but I think it's important to get this on the record and to get it absolutely word perfect. Both Pat and I have referenced a couple of times Project Condign, which was a UK government intelligence study into the UFO phenomenon, at the time classified secret UK eyes only. So one of the most highly classified intelligence documents on UFOs ever to have been drawn up. And parts of it, a few years ago, were declassified and released by the British government as part of a wider program to declassify the archive of UFO files. And I want to read to you the one, almost, if you'll excuse the slightly bad taste pun, but the killer sentence, which really, I think, did force the VA to settle. Because for years, I mean, don't forget, it's been the long-standing policy of the American government to effectively say that since Project Blue Book was closed down in 1969, there's been no official interest and study of UFOs at all. So here you have John Burroughs and Jim Penniston say, we believe that we have health problems attributable to a close encounter with UFOs. May we please, get some sort of settlement and justice? Well, of course, the US government falls back and the VA falls back on this. Well, we're not in the UFO game, so how can we possibly settle? But then the British government declassifies this study, codenamed Project Condign, and it contains the following sentence under the heading non-ionizing electromagnetic effects on humans and electromagnetic field from a plasma. And it goes on to say, this is a direct quote, the well-reported Rendlesham Forest / Bentwaters event is an example where it might be postulated that several observers were probably exposed to unidentified aerial phenomena radiation for longer than normal unidentified aerial phenomena sighting periods. There may be other cases which remain unreported. It's clear that the recipients of these effects are not aware that their behavior / perception of what they're observing is being modified. Now, I don't have to tell you what a bombshell that is. For years, the US government said this didn't happen. And then the British government turns around, releases a highly classified document that says, yes, these people were probably irradiated by whatever it is they encountered. Well, that's why I say that the VA got painted into a corner. And I mean, the provenance of this document, it's not like the MJ-12 documents where there's a debate to be had. You can go on to the British government's own website and read this document. So when Pat said, and when John Burroughs said, well, wait a minute, the British government have just declassified an intelligence study that said we got irradiated, the VA suddenly went, oops, sorry, yeah, okay, we'll settle.
Well, when I think of irradiation, the first thought that comes to me, and I hope this doesn't just get a little bit too personal about them, are issues around sterility. Has that come up for them due to the radiation?
Well, I
hope that's not too personal for them. I don't know,
Dr. Rita, put it this way. A, I don't know, and B, I think if I
you don't want to know.
You can either confirm or deny.
Yeah, I don't think we should get too much into their individual. Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't know. Because I think about we have irradiated fruits and vegetables, and if you try to take those seeds and plant them, they won't grow, period. They just won't grow. So that was just where my thoughts went. Sorry, didn't mean to be nosy or nasty or anything. Did Jim also, we've been talking about John, did Jim, and we have 4 minutes before the break, did Jim also experience health issues from this encounter?
Jim primarily, I know it suffered from some sleep issues, insomnia, basically, but we didn't really end up pursuing him so much, so I don't want to get too much into that other than just what he has said before. But he did have some adverse effects, different from John's. John's, in particular, were life-threatening, like I said, because it involved his heart. But they both suffered some injuries as a result of the proximity. Yes.
And the gentlemen who were part of the radio chain, did they have any ill effects?
Certainly not to the extent of John Burroughs. If they did, I can't say for certain. Nick, you may know. I can't say that
I don't know, and maybe in the second hour we'll get into this. It's more your field. I don't know whether at some stage there would be scope for a class action of some sort, but that's I think your area of expertise, not mine. But yeah, the real problem is we still don't have a complete list of people who were involved who have health issues they believe were attributable.
Wow. After all of this time. Well, I guess no one thought they could claim anything up until recently, or get any kind of satisfaction. Very interesting. I mean, because this thing happened at this point in time, kind of a long time ago.
35 years.
Yeah. Strange. Well, I don't know if Joe's there, but if he's there, I think this would be a great time for us to take our break. Joe, can we go to break now?
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages. And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and I hope you're enjoying the show. We've been here talking to Nick Pope and Pat Frasconia. Well, I'm just looking at your name going, oh, it's going to come out maybe. And we're talking about the new book, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. And it was actually a really good read. So if you're not familiar with it, you should pick it up. I don't know. We've been talking about so many things. I had to kind of regroup during the break to get back on track. All right. So we talked about John and Jim going out to the woods and seeing this craft and having this encounter and health issues and all of that stuff. So now they're back at the base. What happened? I would think that an investigation ensued and things would be kind of left in a bit of an uproar. Nick?
Well, yes, an investigation did ensue, and we got into actually some, I guess you'd call it a bit of a dogfight between the UK and the US authorities over who was going to lead on this. But with regards to the, well, what happened next kind of question, there was a second night of encounter where, again, a whole bunch of security police and law enforcement personnel encountered strange lights. And at one stage, a couple of people were driving a military jeep and a ball of light passed through the open window on one side of the cab, exited the open window on the other side, and one of the personnel involved was so traumatized that they had to be taken off duty literally in shock. And I mean, again, we talked just before the break about some of John and Jim's medical issues. I think it should not be forgotten that PTSD is something that probably is a factor in a lot of this with John, with Jim, with some of the other people. But, if I can just fast forward, because I think this is an important part of the story that we've not touched on yet, is Colonel Charles Holt's involvement with all this.
Okay. Can I just ask one quick question? Quick question. So there was the second encounter. How far after the first encounter did this one occur?
It was the second night. I mean, this was
so it was just the next night. So everybody was still kind of wired and, adrenaline flowing from what happened the night before. Okay.
Yes. And some of the, word gets around on base that something had happened, but I think a lot of the people were disparaging some of the people from the first night and saying, hey, you're the crazy guys who are seeing flying saucers, right? And then they got thrown into the middle of it themselves, and suddenly it wasn't quite so funny. Well, the same thing happened, but on a bigger scale, on the third and final night, because there was an awards ceremony going on with many of the senior military personnel at the entire establishment. And as this ceremony was about to begin, and the awards for the year were about to be handed out, the doors burst open, and one of the lieutenants came in, and he came up to the base commander and the deputy base commander. He saluted, and he said in a shaking voice, "Sir, it's back." And they looked at him for a moment in confusion, and they said, "What are you talking about, man? What's back?" And he said, "The UFO, sir. It's come back." Well, the senior personnel conferred for a moment and then agreed that Charles Holt, the deputy base commander, a lieutenant colonel, would go out there and would investigate this. And Holt, of course, as you can imagine, one moment he's going to be at an awards ceremony, the next moment he's told he's got to go out into the forest in the cold, miserable, darkness of a sort of Christmas night in the UK, freezing cold. He's not very pleased, and he goes out, in his own words, to debunk all this UFO nonsense once and for all. But he is not able to debunk it, and he actually becomes a witness himself. Now, we talked about the radios cutting out on the first night. One of the things that Colonel Holt said is, let's light up the entire forest. If there's anything strange in there, we're going to flush it out. And they had these things called light-alls, which were basically banks of powerful lights on a flatbed trailer. And he got them out into the forest, but they all started malfunctioning. Nothing like this had ever happened before. And he was kind of screaming orders around, and people were running left, right, and center. I mean, it was crazy out there. So he went to the place where John and Jim had their encounter on the first night. And, one of the great complaints from skeptics about UFOs is, oh, well, this is all just hearsay evidence. There's never any physical evidence that this happened. Well, in this case, oh, yes, there was, because Colonel Holt took out with him into the forest the disaster preparedness officer, Munro Nevels, and he had with him a Geiger counter. They went to the place where this encounter had happened on the first night. They ran the Geiger counter around, and they found abnormally high radiation levels, about 7 or 8 times higher than background. And they also found that the trees around the edges of this clearing where John and Jim had seen the UFO land, they were kind of scorched and black. And again, there was high radioactivity levels on the sides facing the clearing. And again, you do not have to take anyone's word for this. This is in the government's own documents. The Ministry of Defense case file on this incident has been released, and although parts of it are still blacked out and some documents have been lost, there is a document which essentially says that the radioactivity levels at the background, at the landing site were, and this is a direct quote from the document, significantly higher than the average background, quote unquote. And this is, like I say, this is in the Ministry of Defense's own formally classified case file on this. So the great thing about this incident is, in a subject where there is a lot of hearsay and there are a few kind of hoaxed stories, this one, you don't have to take anyone's word for it. You can piece together this story from the government's own documents. And that's exactly what John, Jim, Pat, and myself did in the book Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, much of which is based on declassified documents obtained under the US and the UK Freedom of Information Act, as well as from direct first-hand interviews with the witnesses themselves.
You mentioned about the radiation levels being elevated. Could those elevated radiation levels also contribute to some of the health issues that John or perhaps some of the other people may have experienced?
Totally. Absolutely. And that goes back to that quote that I mentioned just before the break, when in Project Condine's final report, it did actually say that this is an incident where it might be postulated that the witnesses had been irradiated for longer periods than necessary. I believe that absolutely gets to the heart of it. And that's certainly, I have no doubt, when taken in conjunction with Pat's kind of sterling and proactive work on this, confronting the VA with these documents, this is absolutely why the VA settled. It's because Project Condine said, yeah, these guys were irradiated. I have no doubt at all.
And it's a terahertz radiation. We're talking earlier about frequencies and such of it. That seems to be the specific source of damage to human tissue, certain kinds of human tissue, such as in the case of John Burroughs, a heart tissue. So.
See, that just makes me start thinking about, Rife and Rife technology, because that's all based on frequency and hertz and whatever, if there's parallels and correlation. But that's a totally different conversation. I won't even go there. You mentioned that Lieutenant Colonel Holt was out there with several men, and they took these measurements. Did he also encounter a craft?
He did not encounter a landed craft, but he certainly saw a number of uncorrelated targets and unidentified objects, whatever terminology you want to use. And at one point, one of these objects was flying around directly overhead, and it fired a narrow beam of light down at the ground, just feet in front of him and his men. And he said in later years, thinking back on this, he said, was this a weapon? Was this a warning? Was this communication? What was this? And to this day, he doesn't know. But this encounter, which started with him going out into the forest, in his own words, to try and debunk all this UFO nonsense, kind of continued to him investigating the landing site and finding these high radiation readings, then segued into him seeing these UFOs and the firing of the narrow beam of light. The very final thing that happened on this third and final night was that he saw the UFO pretty much right back where they started, over the base, firing again, beams of light down at the ground. And he was subsequently told, though he did not witness this himself, he's a very careful and thorough man. He differentiates between what he's seen personally and what he's been told. But he was told that light beams from the UFO penetrated one of the most sensitive areas on this military establishment.
I think what Nick is trying to say, but he doesn't want to say because he can't say, is the light beams are penetrating the weapons storage bunkers, the earthen-covered bunkers in which it's been said there was atomic ordnance in. So,
all right. So I'll ask you this one, Pat. Do you know if there was any situation like they had the encounter in the Midwest where the ordinances were turned off? Did they have a similar type situation where there was something done to the electronics to make them inactive, I guess would be the appropriate term?
I don't know is my first answer to that. Secondly, I would say I don't believe these were, we're not talking about missile silo kind of weapons here.
Okay.
We're talking about things that would go under the wing of a plane. In the bay of a plane.
Got it. But I mean, that would be kind of scary and eerie. And I guess I'm going to throw this to you, Nick. Okay, so we have this situation that happens over a military base. And I remember the last time you came on, you made some comment about, you have UFOs flying over military bases. Don't you think there's an issue around national security? With you having a UFO shining its light on the very sensitive parts of a base, did that information start flying through the military community that there were possible threats? I mean, there's what goes out to civilians, but do you know if there was anything at higher levels of command that raised some concern?
Oh yes, absolutely. One thing we know about the Rendlesham Forest incident, and again, it's not hearsay evidence. We have one of the government's own documents that you can read on the government's own website, whether you go to the Ministry of Defence or the National Archives in the UK. What we know is that in the immediate aftermath of this incident, a couple of things happened. Firstly, it went very rapidly up the chain of command. Right at the top of the show, we talked about the US military presence in the UK. Now, once a week, certainly the senior United States Air Force commander in the UK had a gathering of all the base commanders, and that was General Baisley. And certainly we know that this issue was raised at General Baisley's weekly meeting. But what we have in one of the MOD's documents goes even higher than that. And it states in black and white that items relating to the Rendlesham Forest incident were handed to General Gabriel, who visited the base in the days after this happened. Now, why is this interesting? It's interesting because General Gabriel was CNC USAFE, Commander-in-Chief, United States Air Force in Europe. He was the senior USAF officer in Europe. And we know, because it's in the MOD's own government file on this incident, that he visited the twin bases after this incident. He was briefed, and he took items pertaining to the investigation back to his headquarters at Ramstein in Germany. After that, the trail goes cold. We don't know what happened to the material that he took, which included soil samples, samples from the irradiated trees, and a whole bunch of other things. We don't know what happened after that, but the Ministry of Defense document confirms that he was there. And again, for anyone that thinks, well, so what, a general visited, it goes back to what I said earlier. The public position of the United States government, stated over many years to Congress, to the media, to the public, has been that there's been no official interest in this subject at all since the end of 1969 when Project Blue Book was terminated. Well, if that's true, why is the senior USAF general in Europe being briefed on all this? So, I don't want to make accusations here, but we have what in government terms I would politely characterize as a little bit of a disconnect.
Well, I think we're all pretty smart, and we can kind of connect those very subtle dots together.
Yes, indeed.
But did a cover-up ensue after? Okay, so we have what happened on the first day, and no one's really talking about it. So now we have 3 days of incidents. And, I mean, you kind of talked on it, but did a bigger cover-up ensue?
Well, I don't think I can get in the business of accusing my former employees, so I'm gonna pass this one to Pat.
Oh, I don't think there's any question there was a cover-up. What's interesting about this case is I was told from, I'll just use the term a government insider, let's just say someone in the know, told me in the past couple of years in regards to this. He said that the Rendlesham case was one of many, but it's just the one that got out of the barn. It's the one that the information about it leaked out. And they did what they could to try to tamp it down like they apparently have done in other situations involving military bases, but this landing was one that got out. So I think it's without denying that there's been an attempt to cover it up. And again, it's interesting because perhaps you've heard the description before that if this was something of ours or theirs even, meaning the Soviets, the Chinese, what have you, 35 years later, by now it should have been in an air show somewhere. But it's not. So whatever it was, either we don't know how to create ourselves, so that's essentially what it is. So, yeah, that was a cover-up without question, without any question.
Just weird. Okay, let's talk about some of the other things that I've heard tied to this case. I mean, I've heard it put forward that it was believed that what John and Jim and all of the people at the base saw was a lighthouse that was several miles away, and it was the strobing, turning light of the lighthouse that they saw in the forest, and they couldn't see it wasn't a UFO.
No, let me take
with that one.
Let me take a swing at that one. That's just nothing more than a disinformation campaign that was launched pretty much right after the incident by the disinformation artists that landed there, that came in after the incident. There are so many ways that you can knock that ridiculous theory. One is it's akin to the Roswell case, the Roswell Army Airfield, and thinking that all of those the military personnel there could mistake a weather balloon for a saucer or a structured craft. And it's the same thing at Bentwaters and Woodbridge. I mean, we talked about Jim Penniston and his ability to identify all types of aircraft and so forth. These are not people that for some reason mistook a beam of light from a lighthouse as a craft that's landed in the forest. It's also, as John Burroughs has told me many times before, he said they were all very familiar with that lighthouse, where it was, what it looked like, whether you were looking at it directly outside of your eye or from a lying down position. In other words, they all knew where it was and how it behaved, the light in the forest. It's just a ludicrous kind of theory. So, not to mention that a lighthouse doesn't leave scuff marks on trees like Nick was talking about, or elevated radiation readings, or cause heart damage to someone like John Burroughs. It's a ridiculous theory. Now, in the last, I believe it's a year or so, I was speaking with John about this, and he made some reference to, did you hear that they're closing the Orford, or shuttering the Orford Nest Lighthouse? And I said, no, I didn't. And he said, well, you know what that means? There'll be no more UFOs in Rendlesham Forest.
Are there any other stories that have come out, kind of like this lighthouse thing of what they really experienced?
Nick, you could probably answer that one better than I.
Well, the lighthouse theory was always just, certainly we in the MOD regarded it as a joke and a useful way to discredit. I mean, don't forget, with apologies, but I worked for the Ministry of Defense for 21 years, and when I did 3 years on the UFO project, and while I was there, of course, it was my job to downplay our interest in this, and if you want to use this term, to debunk all of this. So yes, it was absolutely, it was very useful to us when people said, oh, maybe it was the lighthouse, because it just, the whole thing descended into farce. Clearly, there are some more credible skeptical theories. The main one is, of course, that what these people encountered was some secret prototype aircraft or drone. But of course, if that were the case, this technology would have emerged by now. Aviation technology runs, around about 10, 15 years maybe ahead of what's publicly declared. Well, the description of what these people encountered, we're now 35 years on, and there's nothing remotely close to this. I think take a look at the sketches of this and the symbols on the side. No one's got anything like this. The other theory that was put forward, which I guess has at first glance a little bit of believability about it, is the idea that this was some secret test of the security guard force. There's been some talk in the conspiracy theory community about something called Project Bluebeam, which is the idea that you could fake something like the Second Coming or an alien invasion through some mixture of Hollywood special effects, holographic technology, drugs, hypnosis, whatever. And of course, if you could produce an event on that scale, clearly you could manipulate entire populations. So that's the sort of idea that's been put around. But again, when one looks into this and the possibility that this was done by the Americans on British soil, I mean, it just doesn't stack up. And, nor does the fact that you could pull something like that off even today, let alone back in 1980. But just to answer your question, those are the sorts of skeptical theories doing the rounds that have a little bit more credibility than the local lighthouse.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of a scary thought to think that they were administered some kind of hallucinogen when they have, sensitive material stockpiled there, because somebody could go a little cuckoo and do something untoward.
Well, they couldn't, because there were very strict firstly, to answer your question, I think that's one reason to show that theory doesn't hold water, because you're absolutely right. Of course, you wouldn't mess around with these people's minds with the nature of the mission of the base. But the other thing is that anyone at these military establishments who was involved in sensitive duties had to undergo what was called PRP, Personnel Reliability Program, which was extra security vetting to make sure that there was nothing in their past or their psychological makeup that would cause any instability. And had there been the slightest hint of anything like that, these people would have instantly been taken off duty. And of course, they're all on the buddy system. Everyone's watching everyone else. So none of this holds up. Having said that, there have certainly been some fairly credible accusations that after the UFO encounter, some of the witnesses were the subject of aggressive debriefings. And indeed, there is a Colonel Holt himself wrote about this, and he said, and again, I think this is so important that if you'll forgive me, I will actually just read a verbatim quote from Colonel Charles Holt. And he went on to say, Office of Special Investigations operatives harshly interrogated 5 young airmen, some of them in shock at the time, who were key witnesses. And he then said, drugs such as sodium pentothal, often called a truth serum when used with some other form of brainwashing or hypnosis, were administered during these interrogations, and the whole thing has had damaging and lasting effect on the men involved. And again, if this was some anonymous comment on a blog, you might dismiss it. But when it comes from the deputy base commander, who retired as a full colonel, I think one has to sit up and pay a little bit more attention.
And kind of following up on that, and this is a question from the chat room from Neutron directed to Pat. And we talked about this, but there's a little add-on on the end, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. Any military experiencers get abruptly transferred out from the base unexpectedly, never to be seen again following the incident. But the, I think, important part, never to be seen again following the incident.
Do I know of any? Is that the question?
Yeah.
No, I can't say that I know of any that were never seen again.
Okay.
Yeah, let me kind of come in on that. I don't know whether the questioner literally means that these people were kind of I don't know, assassinated or
eliminated
away.
Yeah.
I don't believe that. And indeed, if you go back to the time period of the Rendlesham Forest incident, 1980, there would have been no need for that anyway. I mean, all that you need to do in those pre-internet, pre-cell phone, pre-social media days, all you need to do is split the people up by posting them, some to Germany, some to Korea, some to America, some to the UK, wherever, So you don't need to do anything like that. I don't believe that the government had any of these people killed. Like I say, I don't think they would do that. I don't think they needed to do that. All they needed to do was split them up, and the story goes away. But the questioner is right on this. There does seem to have been a policy of doing that, and I think earlier in one of your questions, you mentioned some of the alleged incidents at nuclear facilities, the Maelstrom base, the Minot Air Force Base. I think one sees this pattern with people being split up like that.
Interesting. Pat, you were talking about Roswell just a minute ago, and kind of comparing it to the incident in Rendlesham Forest. How how could they not mistake an air balloon or a hot air balloon or whatever, weather balloon? And I'm just going to throw in this little piece. In 1940s, it was kind of pre-science fiction. I mean, there was some Jules Verne where I could see, and this is just being ultra kind on my part, where there might be some confusion. Some. But when you're talking 1980s, we had the whole 1950s sci-fi genre. We had Star Wars. Star Wars had come out by then. We had Star Trek. And so people were used to the concept of UFOs. And so I can't see how they could mix that up, because there is this cognitive understanding just from our media about what a UFO is, potentially. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, yeah. I mean, you're speaking at Roswell. They couldn't have confused. Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean, I'm just being very kind that there is the possibility that there might have been some confusion at the Roswell case, but in this encounter, I can't see how there would be confusion about seeing a lighthouse or it wasn't a UFO.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Again, I go back to my first interest in this began in 2008 when I first became aware of this case. And I'd never been any kind of UFO enthusiast. I had some interest in it, but I wasn't an enthusiast. But when I first became aware of this case, it immediately struck me as very different from everything else, even Roswell. It was very different, given the caliber of the witnesses, where it happened, how it happened, what they described as having happened, what they saw, everything. And, just a moment ago, Nick was talking about, or we were talking about the behavior of the craft, but I don't think we've actually said it tonight. Jim Penniston described it as moving at an impossible speed. When it actually lifted off from the forest floor and the encounter ended that first night, it took off at an impossible speed, according to Jim. And it's just, how do you confuse that with anything else but what you say you saw? And I just can't imagine. I agree with you. There's just no room for any kind of misinterpretation of the event by the observers.
One of the things that you released in the book was the recording that Lieutenant Colonel Holt made on the third day of the encounters. Does he talk about seeing the lights or anything like that was actually documented on his recorder?
Yes, he documents that in the recording. That's in the transcript, of course, in the book.
I mean, to me, that's kind of like smoking gun, just short of having video, and it's not like people had video. But didn't someone take pictures also there?
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up earlier. Actually, Jim Penniston did, and it was part of what his investigation that night. And when he turned them over to the base photo lab, and when he got them back, I believe they were all overexposed. Now, whether that was because of any kind of radiation, if you're old enough, you can remember being afraid to take your camera through any kind of scanners at the airport because people used to be fearful that it was going to expose their film when they did so. And whether that was true or not, I don't remember. But in this case, it's unknown whether that was the reason or whether it was done deliberately by someone at Bentwaters.
I just don't see how this case is not seen as being kind of the smoking gun evidence. I just don't understand that.
I think it is now, and I think it certainly in the eyes of the mainstream media and maybe the UFO community too. I don't know. It is becoming. It's displacing Roswell in a sense. I think the feeling now with Roswell is, look, whatever happened there, this is now what, over 70 years in the past, coming up to 70, whatever it is. The feeling is that with Roswell, all the primary witnesses, certainly the major players, are now dead. There are some peripheral players around, but no one is going to be able to really crack this one. But with Rendlesham Forest, I think all of the primary witnesses are still very much alive. And this it's interesting. When you look at the UFO shows on TV at the moment, Ancient Aliens, Unsealed, UFOs Declassified, Close Encounters, and all those sorts of shows. Increasingly, it's Rendlesham Forest that you see on those shows and not Roswell. Now, part of that is practical. obviously the TV industry knows that they can't really do Roswell with most of the witnesses now dead, but they can do Rendlesham. So I think we are seeing a sea change here. I think it'll only be a matter of time before we see a movie on the Rendlesham Forest incident, much as we saw the movie on Roswell a few years back with Kyle MacLachlan and was it Martin Sheen? Anyway, I can't remember, but it's only a matter of time, I'm sure. So I think your question is a great one. You know, why isn't this the smoking gun? And I think the answer to your question is it's getting there. It just takes a little while to shake off that baggage of Roswell. I mean, you stop people in the street, they've probably heard of Roswell. But I think in 2, 3, 4 years' time, if you stop people in the street, Rendlesham Forest will be the case that they mention. So I think it's the new smoking gun. I think it's the media's new poster child for all this. And I think it's the UFO community's new flagship case. And rightly so. Rightly so. This is, with no shadow of a doubt, not just the United Kingdom, but the world's best evidenced and most compelling UFO sighting. I mean, I've called this before the perfect storm. Everything that you think would make a UFO case compelling comes together in this one single incident. It was over 3 different nights, multiple witnesses. Those witnesses were highly trained military personnel. There is radar evidence. There is physical evidence in terms of indentations in the ground, scorch marks on the trees, high radioactivity levels. And we've got a paper trail of the government's own documents, British and American. What more could you want? Short of a landing on the White House lawn, this really is it.
I absolutely concur. All right, I'm looking at the clock. One of the things that I wanted to make sure we talked about during the show was, and I guess it was Jim, ended up receiving some kind of a binary code. Was that was Jim, right?
Yes.
Can you talk about that? You know, like what the story was around that, and since it was a binary code, did anybody try to decipher it?
Jim, shortly after the incident, felt a need to sit down, or he did sit down one evening and felt a need to start writing zeros and ones in a notebook, which he did. And he did several, page after page after page. And they have been interpreted, Nick, you'll have to speak to that, but they have been interpreted as some coordinates around the planet. Nick?
Yes. That's correct. What happened was when Jim touched the side of this craft, and I mentioned earlier the strange symbols on the side, it was when he touched the largest, what he perceived as the last of those symbols, that there was a flash of light, and he got what he could only describe as a telepathic download, a compulsion. And obviously, I don't have to tell you, this is hugely controversial, but certainly an eclectic group of esoteric researchers, cryptographers, computer programmers have gotten together to try and figure out what this might mean. And one of the translations that's doing the rounds at the moment reads as follows: exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance, eyes of your eyes, origin year 8100. And then a series, as Pat said, of longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates that coincide with a number of sites believed to be of great significance spiritually, religiously, whatever. The Great Pyramid in Giza, the Nazca lines in Peru, the Temple of Apollo in Greece. And work on this is continuing. And I mean, there are all sorts of theories floating around about this. I mean, this phrase origin year 8100, of course, has people saying, well, wait a minute, are we dealing not with extraterrestrials, but time travelers? A few years ago, that would have been dismissed as science fiction, but now there are some scientists, particularly a professor called Ronald Mallet, who are publishing material on theoretical physics behind time travel. And how do they say that a message would be sent into the past? By binary. And how you would do that would be through a radioactive source that would decay with neutrinos, either to a positive or a negative spin. So again, you have this tie-in with the radioactivity at Rendlesham Forest at the landing site. As I say, this sort of thing sounds like it should be science fiction, and a few years ago it would have been. Same with interdimensional issues. A few years ago, people would have said sci-fi. Now, what do we see if we follow the news? We see scientists at the Large Hadron Collider talk quite openly about the search for hidden dimensions. So I think we live in a very exciting time where a lot of things which would have been sci-fi a few years ago are now becoming science fact. What does this all mean in relation to Rendlesham Forest? I don't know, but I think it's something that we know from the paper trail that governments were taking seriously many years ago. Maybe they knew something that the rest of us didn't.
And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because we're running out. There have been multiple interpretations of the binary.
Yes, there have. The one that I read was the main one. But I mean, again, we're straying into areas where I probably, because of my security oath, can't go into too many details. But what I will say very briefly is this. Obviously, when you're looking at cryptography, very often you have a kind of a beacon, which is just an attention getter. And in a sense, a string of coordinates that happen to coincide with sites like the Great Pyramid. Well, that's an attention getter. It gets
my attention.
Yes, but my point is, I think that if there's a real message, it's probably deeper in, and that would take the sorts of supercomputers that the NSA have to get to.
Fair enough. Why did John and Jim, and did this Lieutenant Colonel Holt, did he also come forward to tell their story? I mean, you hear from the Roswell incident that everybody was, threatened and sworn to secrecy. Why did these guys come forward, and aren't they scared about coming forward?
Well, they were kind of outed. I mean, Colonel Holt, when he was first told back in '83 that his original memo to the Ministry of Defense was going to be made public under the Freedom of Information Act, he knew the guy who was handling the FOI request, and he said, please, as a favor, take that memo and burn it. Well, the guy said, I'm sorry, I can't do that, but these people did not willingly end up in this place. They were kind of outed, and it was the paper trail that outed them.
And they aren't afraid, about coming forward, or I'm not even sure how to ask the question. I mean, because I think it's very interesting that the UK has released all of these files, which has outed them, but the US hasn't.
Well,
and the conflict that it would create for individuals who are kind of caught in the middle because they're Americans, but that information wasn't American.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. The British government declassifying and releasing Project Condign kind of, I think then the feeling was, well, hey, if the Brits have done this, a government's done it. But, even the commanding officer of the base, General Gordon Williams, who's now in his 80s, he's spoken about this a couple of times in fairly general terms. Truth be told. But once your commanding officers discussed it, I think it does give some of the other people that little bit of top cover, and they say, well, hey, look, if the commanding officer's talking about this, I guess there's not a problem. So yes, John and Jim are still mindful of their security oaths, and they're not whistleblowers. They're extremely loyal people who've given years of their lives, the best years of their lives, to service of their country, for which we should all thank them. But you know, when they see the senior officers talking about this, the generals and the colonels, it does give them a little bit of top cover that they didn't have before.
And what are they doing now? I'm assuming they're retired from the military. Are they working in the civilian world, or, you know, what are they up to these days? John and Jim, that is.
Well, I don't know if retired is quite the right word. They're actually too young for retirement age, you know, kind of activities, or a lifestyle. But you know, they're open to employment in, you know, various forms that they might want to take, but nothing that I would call necessarily a career path kind of thing, or certainly military. Quite frankly, they've been through enough. And
let me just add this on. I mean, are they suffering from PTSD, and is that impacting their lives in general?
I wouldn't say that necessarily. You know, are they capable of carrying on normal lives? Yes. I mean, it's not like they're not capable or anything. I think it's just more of a choice. If they're not doing anything, it's their choice. It's not because they're not capable.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. Looking at the clock, we still have like 6 or 7 more minutes. Is there anything that we didn't cover, Nick or Pat, that you think needs to get some airtime regarding this case?
Well, I know that John Burroughs, and I would certainly thank Senator John McCain's help. I mentioned earlier about Senator John Kyle. Was with us for about a year until he retired from the Senate. And John McCain's office picked up the torch and carried it with us, and they did a wonderful job, needless to say. It was something they didn't have to do, because this is not exactly, John's case is not exactly one that a lot of folks would flock to help do anything. But they did. They did. And perhaps that is because the senator is a veteran himself. But the team that ultimately came together created a good result for John, and that's all that really mattered in the end.
Yes, and I think there are at least 6 other former congressional representatives who have been involved in this under on behalf of John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, and they are Merrill Cook, Roscoe Bartlett, Darlene Hooley, Caroline Kilpatrick, Mike Gravel, and Lynn Woolsey. And they, along with Senator John Kyle and Senator John McCain, deserve our full gratitude and thanks on this. I mean, you know, again, it's quite unprecedented, the levels that this encounter in Rendlesham Forest has reached. The fact that you have all these senators and these former congressional representatives involved in this story, giving so willingly of their time to try and help John Burroughs and Jim Penniston.
And that is to be commended, that anybody would step forward, you know. In today's day and age, you know, you just don't see that, you know, and I think that that's wonderful that they're getting help and the support that they need. So,
yes, it's easy to ridicule, you know, and this, I was a part of this. The government uses the ridicule factor to downplay the true extent of its involvement and interest in this. But here you have, with those former congressional representatives that I mentioned, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, all coming together and saying, look, we don't necessarily know what happened to these people, but something happened. And they gave decades of their life in service of their country, and that loyalty should flow both ways. So it's of great. This isn't a party political issue. Like I say, it's Republicans, Democrats, and Libertarians all came together to help John and Jim on this.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So we have like 2 minutes left, and one of the things that you guys had spoken to me about during the break was a World UFO Festival happening in Tennessee. Do you want to spend a minute talking about that?
Absolutely. The folks with MUFON in Tennessee are putting on the World UFO Day Festival, first time. It'll be in Memphis, Tennessee, on July 2nd, and Nick Pope will be present for that, and I will be there as well, and we're really looking forward to it and wishing the folks in Tennessee with MUFON a very successful first year with their festival.
Okay, so Nick's going to be speaking. Anybody else that we might know going to be there as well?
There is a Captain Lamar Todd, I believe, who was the SWAT team member in Memphis in 1977, who witnessed a large black triangular craft go over the city with the rest of his SWAT team. He's going to be one of the speakers this year, and certainly one that I'm looking forward to the most, because here again you have another credible witness of a major UFO event that is going to be very exciting to hear, because it's a story that was covered at the time, but like so many of the good stories, you don't hear much about them again. It's unfortunate. But we'll see him in Memphis, and of course, Nick, you're lined up to speak or just promote?
Both, I think. So looking forward to being there and seeing you again, Pat, and seeing anyone who wants to come along.
Well, and I just think that it's great that the South, I have to think about it, East, is starting to open itself up to some of these alternative concepts that weren't really accepted before. So, yay to Tennessee.
That's the story for another show there, Dr. Rita.
Yes, I think so. But we need to go. The music's going to start rolling in a second. Nick, if somebody wants to get the book Encounters in Rendlesham Forest, Amazon, any of those places?
Just Google Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. You can get it on Amazon. You can also on my website, nickpope.net. It's on the latest news. It's there. But yeah, the book is Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, and it's by John, Jim, Pat, and myself. And it sets all this out, including some of the government documents we've talked about.
In national bookstores as well.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Guys, thank you so much for coming on and spending time talking about your wonderful book. And we'll have to do it again.
Thanks, Dr. Rita. Great to talk to you again.
Okay. Bye-bye. That's Nick Pope and Pat Fransconia. The book is Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. Next week, we're going to be speaking with Marshall Barnes about the myth of Stephen Hawking. Until next time.